Champagne smells like wet pennies if you leave it out long enough. Naira knew this because she had been clearing half-empty crystal flutes for 4 hours straight. Her feet throbbed in stiff orthopedic shoes, the blister on her left heel weeping into cheap cotton. Across the ballroom, diamonds caught the chandelier light dripping from the necks of women who hadn't worked a day in their lives. She just wanted to clock out. Instead, she backed right into the most dangerous man in the city. The Grand Solstice Gala was an exercise in synchronized breathing. If you inhaled too sharply, you ran the risk of inhaling a lungful of someone else's Tom Ford cologne, or snagging your uniform on a sequined dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Neera kept her breathing shallow. She stood by the carved ice sculpture of a swan that was currently dripping lukewarm water onto the expensive Persian rug. Her black polyester vest chafed against her neck, the fabric holding on to the greasy, heavy scent of the roasted duck hors d'oeuvres she had been passing out since 7 o'clock. It was 11 now. 4 more hours. 4 more hours, and she could take the N train back to her humid apartment, peel off the black support hose that felt like a second skin of rubber, and count the tips that wouldn't quite cover her electricity bill. Naira. Tray. Gary, the floor manager, snapped his fingers near her ear. He smelled of nervous sweat and peppermint breath mints. Table 4 needs clearing, and then you're on the perimeter loop. And fix your collar. You look like you slept in it. Naira didn't argue. Arguing took energy, and she was operating on a half-eaten granola bar and 3 sips of flat ginger ale. She simply nodded, adjusted the scratchy collar of her white button-down, and picked up a fresh, heavy silver tray loaded with fresh glasses of Dom Perignon. Navigating the perimeter of the ballroom meant navigating the apex predators of the city's elite. Tonight, the center of gravity was heavily skewed toward the east wing, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. They were waiting for Roman Castor. Naira only knew the name because Gary had spent the pre-shift briefing hyperventilating about it. Castor isn't just a VIP, he's the foundation of this city's private shipping sector. If his glass is empty, it's your ass. Naira knew what private shipping sector meant. Everyone in the lower income brackets did. It meant ghost ports. It meant men in dark coats who broke kneecaps over missed payments in the alleys behind her apartment building. It meant blood money laundered through charity galas exactly like this one. She approached the east wing, keeping her eyes cast down, a ghost in a catering uniform. The inner circle was already formed. 5 women had positioned themselves like sentinels around the velvet roped-off VIP lounge, a masterclass in aggressive high society posturing. There was Victoria, a real estate heiress with collarbones sharp enough to cut glass, and a smile that never reached her cold, pale blue eyes. She wore a slip of silver silk that left nothing to the imagination. Next to her, practically elbowing her out of the way, was Madeline New Money, and desperate to prove it, dripping in heavy emeralds that clashed with her spray tan. Genevieve and Sabrina, 2 old money socialites, who looked like bored identical greyhounds, stood sipping vodka martinis, while Chloe, a prominent judge's daughter, laughed too loudly at a joke no one had made. They were a terrifying wall of perfume, jasmine, heavy musk, and synthetic roses competing to suffocate the air. Then the ambient noise of the ballroom shifted. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a subtle dampening of sound. Laughter tapered off. The clinking of glasses slowed. Naira paused, balancing the heavy tray on her fingertips. Roman Castor didn't make a grand entrance. He didn't have to. He simply materialized from the mahogany side doors, flanked by 2 men who looked less like security and more like moving brick walls. He wasn't conventionally handsome in the polished plastic way of the actors and politicians in the room. He was tall, but he didn't swagger. He occupied space with a heavy, exhausting permanence. His hair was dark, cropped short at the sides, and his jaw looked like it was permanently set in irritation. He wore a charcoal suit that lacked the shiny sheen of the billionaires around him. It was matte, impeccably tailored, and understated. As he walked, the crowd parted. It was instinctual, like fish making way for a shark. He looked incredibly deeply bored. Naira watched from the periphery as the 5 women immediately tightened their circle. Victoria smoothed her hair, her posture snapping to attention. Madeleine thrust her chest forward. They descended on him the moment he stepped past the velvet rope. Roman Victoria purred, stepping directly into his path, forcing him to stop. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." Naira rolled her eyes, turning away to clear a discarded plate of oyster shells. She had seen feral cats fight over a chicken bone with more dignity. "Naira," Gary hissed from behind a pillar, his face flushed blotchy red. "What are you doing? His section is empty. Get the tray over there. Now." "They're swarming him, Gary," Naira whispered back, shifting the weight of the tray. Her forearm was cramping. "I can't get through. Make a hole. If he doesn't have a drink in his hand in 30 seconds, I'm docking your pay." Naira swallowed the sharp, venomous retort sitting on her tongue. The math flashed in her head. Docked pay meant eating rice and soy sauce for the next 6 days. She took a breath, plastered on a blank, deferential expression, and waded into the shark tank. The closer she got to the VIP section, the hotter it felt. The combined body heat of the desperate elite, masked by thousands of dollars of conflicting fragrances, made the air thick and cloying. "Roman darling, you simply must see the new estate in the Hamptons." Madeleine was saying, her voice a shrill, grating pitch. She reached out her hand, hovering just millimeters from the sleeve of his suit. He didn't pull away, but his eyes, a flat, deadpan amber, flicked to her hand with such chilling indifference that Madeleine slowly lowered it. "I don't care for the beach, Madeleine," Roman said. His voice was low, rough around the edges, like tires on gravel. It wasn't a seductive purr. It sounded like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days and was tired of pretending to be polite. Naira slipped through a gap between 2 hedge fund managers, aiming for the small mahogany table next to Roman. "Just drop the drinks. Drop them and run." "Well, if you prefer the city, my father is hosting a private dinner tomorrow," Chloe interrupted, stepping in front of Genevieve. "Strictly off the record. You know how he values your insights." Genevieve bristled. "Oh, please, Chloe. Roman doesn't want to talk politics. He wants to relax." She leaned in closer, the scent of her heady gardenia perfume practically slapping Naira in the face as she squeezed past. "Excuse me," Naira murmured, her voice flat. "Champagne." None of them moved. They didn't even register her existence. To them she was a piece of the furniture, a moving table. "Actually," Victoria cut in her voice, dripping with artificial sweetness, "I was hoping Roman would let me steal him away for a moment. There's a piece in the silent auction I need an expert eye on." Victoria took a decisive step backward to box out Sabrina, planting her stiletto heel firmly onto the floor. Except she didn't plant it on the floor. She planted the needle-thin heel directly onto the toe of Naira's cheap orthopedic shoe. The pain was sharp and instantaneous. Naira gasped, her instinct overriding her training. She jerked her foot back. The physics of the moment were agonizingly slow, yet entirely unavoidable. Naira's sudden shift in weight threw her off balance. Her ankle rolled. The heavy silver tray, slick with condensation, tipped sharply to the left. Naira tried to compensate, gripping the edge so hard her knuckles popped, but a tall, frosted flute of Dom Perignon toppled over. It hit another glass, which hit another. A cacophony of shattering crystal ripped through the quiet murmur of the VIP section. 3 glasses exploded against the polished marble floor. But the fourth glass didn't hit the floor. The fourth glass tipped directly forward, emptying 8 ounces of chilled, sticky champagne straight down the front of Roman Caster's bespoke charcoal wool suit. Silence slammed into the room. It wasn't the subtle dampening from before. It was a complete, suffocating vacuum of sound. The string quartet in the corner seemed to stutter and die. Naira fell to her knees, hitting the hard marble with a painful crack. She didn't look up at his face. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked in horror on the dark, spreading stain ruining the fabric of his trousers and jacket. Oh God, she thought, the panic a cold block of ice in her chest. I'm dead. Not fired. Dead. Oh my God! Victoria shrieked, breaking the silence, jumping back, as if the champagne were acid. Security! Madeline gasped, clutching her emeralds. Are you entirely incompetent? Chloe yelled, looking down at Naira with undisguised disgust. Look what you did. Naira's hands were shaking. She ignored the women. Her mind was racing, trying to calculate the cost. A suit like that. 5,010. The glasses are 45 each. I can't pay for this. I can't. Desperation made her stupid. She grabbed the cheap cotton napkin, tucked into her waistband, and reached out, intending to dab at the ruin of his jacket. Before her fingers could brush the fabric, a large, heavy hand clamped around her wrist. The grip wasn't bruising, but it was absolute, an immovable force. Naira gasped, her head snapping up. Roman Caster was looking down at her. Up close, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes were deeper. He smelled of cold air bergamot, and now the sharp, yeasty tang of spilled alcohol. His eyes weren't angry. That was the most terrifying part. They were completely, eerily calm. He looked at her the way a mechanic looks at a strange piece of an engine that just fell out of a car. Don't, he said. The word was quiet, but it vibrated through the floorboards. He released her wrist. Naira scrambled backward, her hands flattening against the floor. Pain flared hot and sharp in the meat of her palm. She hissed, pulling her hand up. A jagged shard of the crystal flute had sliced deeply into the base of her thumb. Blood welled instantly, bright red against her pale, shaking skin. Roman, I am so sorry. Victoria was babbling, pulling a monogrammed silk handkerchief from her clutch. Let me help you with that. This staff is completely inept. Quiet. Roman didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Victoria. He kept his eyes locked on Naira. Victoria's mouth snapped shut. The other 4 women froze, the aggressive energy draining out of them, replaced by a sudden, very real apprehension. Gary came skidding to a halt behind Roman, his face pale and sweating profusely. Mr. Caster, sir, I am profoundly apologetic. I will have her removed from the premises immediately. She's fired. She'll pay for the cleaning. She'll... Shut up, Roman said. Gary swallowed his tongue. Roman crouched down. His joints popped slightly. He ignored the ruined fabric of his pants, letting the wet wool rest against the back of his calves as he balanced on his toes. He was now eye level with Naira, who was kneeling in a puddle of champagne and broken glass, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. She looked pathetic. She knew she looked pathetic. Her hair was falling out of its messy bun, her uniform was stained, and she was bleeding. But as she looked back into the flat, heavy gaze of the city's most dangerous man, the panic suddenly curdled into exhaustion. She was so tired. Tired of Gary, tired of the rich women, tired of her feet bleeding and her hands shaking. She didn't cower. She just glared at him, a muscle ticking in her jaw. It was an accident, she said, her voice raspy, lacking any of the simpering apologies Gary or Victoria had offered. She stepped on my foot. Roman's gaze flicked to Naira's cheap orthopedic shoe, noting the dusty footprint scuffed across the black toe. Then slowly he tilted his head, looking up at the 5 women standing above them. His eyes swept over Victoria Madeline, Genevieve Sabrina, and Chloe. They looked like statues, terrified to breathe. "Which one?" Roman asked. Naira blinked. "What? Which one of them stepped on you?" Naira looked up at the women. Victoria's pale eyes were wide with thinly veiled panic. A silent, desperate threat radiated from the heiress. "Say it was me, and I will destroy you." Naira looked back at Roman. He wasn't asking for justice. He was asking for data. "It doesn't matter," Naira muttered, pulling a clean corner of her shirt tail out to wrap around her bleeding thumb. "The suit is ruined. I don't have the money to replace it." Roman watched her wrap the makeshift bandage. She tied it off with her teeth and her good hand, her movements jerky and irritated. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She just looked incredibly annoyed by the inconvenience of bleeding. A strange, subtle shift occurred in Roman's expression. The deep boredom that had anchored his features since he walked into the room cracked just slightly. A flicker of genuine curiosity sparked in his amber eyes. He stood up. The movement was fluid, surprisingly graceful for a man of his bulk. He looked at Gary, who was practically vibrating with anxiety. "What is her name?" Roman asked. "Naira, sir." Gary babbled quickly. "Naira Hayes. She's a temp. She won't be back, I assure you." "Naira Hayes," Roman repeated. He tested the syllables as if weighing them. He pulled a dark linen handkerchief from his breast pocket and began wiping the sticky champagne off his hands. Roman Victoria tried again, stepping forward, forcing a trembling, sympathetic smile. "Please let me take you up to a suite. We can get that suit seen too. You shouldn't have to deal with this." She reached out, touching his forearm. Roman stopped wiping his hands. He looked down at Victoria's fingers resting on his sleeve. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. One of the massive men standing behind Roman shifted his weight, the leather of his shoulder holster creaking audibly. Victoria snatched her hand back as if the wool had burned her. "I don't need a suite, Victoria." Roman said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. He tossed the damp champagne-soaked handkerchief directly onto Victoria's silver silk dress. She gasped as it left a dark, wet mark, but she didn't dare complain. Roman turned his back on the 5 elite women. He dismissed them entirely. It was a brutal, thorough erasure of their presence. He looked down at Naira, who was still kneeling on the floor using a bar towel to hastily sweep the broken glass into a pile. "Get up," he said. Naira paused, a shard of glass pinched between her fingers. She looked up. "I have to clean this." "Leave it." "Gary will charge me for the glass, and if I leave a hazard," I said. Roman's voice dropped half an octave, a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver down the back of Naira's sweaty neck. "Leave it." Naira dropped the glass. She grabbed the edge of the table and pulled herself up. Her left ankle throbbed in protest, and she favored her right leg, wincing slightly. Roman looked her up and down, the stained vest, the messy hair, the bloody makeshift bandage. He turned to Gary. "She's not fired." Gary blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. Sir, and she's off the clock." Roman reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a thick silver money clip, and peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills. He dropped them onto Gary's clipboard. "For the glasses. And her shift." Naira stared at the money. $500. It was more than she made in a week. "I don't understand," Gary stammered. "It's not complicated," Roman said, stepping closer to Naira. The scent of him spilled wine, and cold violence made her want to step back, but she forced her feet to stay planted. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer her his arm or a reassuring smile. He just looked at her with that intense, unnerving focus. "She's with me now," Roman stated to the room at large. Behind him, Madeline let out a soft, strangled gasp of disbelief. Chloe's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Victoria looked as though she had been physically struck. They had spent hours contouring, politicking, and preening for a crumb of his attention, and he was walking away with a bleeding temp worker who smelled like duck fat. Naira felt the blood drain from her face. "I am absolutely not with you." The corner of Roman's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to amusement she had seen from him. "Yes, you are," he said. "Walk Naira." "To where?" She snapped the fear, making her aggressive. "You want to take me out back and shoot me for ruining your pants?" The two bodyguards let out low, rough chuckles. Roman just stared at her. "If I wanted to shoot you, I wouldn't have paid your manager," Roman said practically. "We are going to find a quiet place in this god-forsaken building where I don't have to listen to politicians' daughters talk about the Hamptons. And you are going to put pressure on that hand before you bleed out on my shoes." He turned and began walking toward the heavy brass doors of the West Wing corridors, fully expecting her to follow. Naira stood frozen. She looked at Gary, who aggressively jerked his head, silently screaming at her to go. She looked at the 5 elite women whose expressions had morphed from shock into pure, unadulterated venom. Her thumb throbbed. Her rent was due in 3 days, and the man who effectively ran the city's underworld had just purchased her time for the rest of the evening. Naira looked at the $500 on the clipboard, took a deep breath of stale, perfume-choked air, and limped after him. The transition from the grand ballroom to the service corridors was like passing through an airlock. The heavy brass doors swallowed the chaotic din of the string quartet and the overlapping shrieks of laughter, replacing it with the low industrial hum of the central heating system. The air back here didn't smell of expensive perfume and roasted duck. It smelled of lemon floor wax, damp concrete, and the ozone scent of overworked machinery. Naira limped behind Roman. The 2 brick-wall bodyguards trailed them, their heavy footsteps echoing against the linoleum. Every time Naira's ruined left shoe hit the floor, a fresh spike of pain shot up her calf. Roman didn't look back to see if she was following. He navigated the labyrinth of service hallways with the heavy, unhurried stride of a man who owned the concrete beneath his feet. He stopped at a heavy oak door at the end of a dead-end corridor. One of the guards stepped forward, keyed a code into the digital lock, and pushed it open. "Stay outside," Roman murmured. The guards nodded, stepping back to flank the frame. Roman walked in. Naira hesitated at the threshold, her survival instincts dulled by exhaustion, and low blood sugar finally flared. This was how people disappeared. You walked into a windowless room with a man who laundered money through ghost ports, and you ended up in a landfill. "I can just go to the employee break room," Naira said, her voice tight. "There's a sink. I can wrap my hand there." Roman paused in the center of the room. He turned slowly. Under the harsh fluorescent overhead light, the wet stain on his suit looked black. "Naira," he said, the exhaustion pulling at the corners of his mouth. "If I wanted to kill you, I wouldn't have brought you to a room with a security camera right above the door." Naira glanced up. A small black dome blinked a steady red light at her. "Come in and sit down," he said, turning away. Naira crossed the threshold. The door clicked shut heavily behind her, sealing them in. It was an old humidor, repurposed as a VIP holding room, and then evidently forgotten. The walls were lined with empty mahogany shelves. A cracked leather sofa sat in the center, flanked by a low glass coffee table. The air was dry and smelled faintly of old tobacco and dust. Roman was already shrugging out of his ruined jacket. He didn't handle it with precious care. He peeled it off like a damp rag and tossed it over the back of a leather armchair. The white button-down shirt beneath it was impeccably pressed, but a damp, yellowing stain of champagne had bled through the silk lining of the jacket onto his ribs. He walked over to a small mirrored wet bar tucked in the corner. He opened a cabinet, rummaged around, and pulled out a dusty white plastic first aid kit. "Sit," he repeated, pointing to the sofa. Naira sat. The leather cracked under her weight. She felt entirely displaced, a cheap stained napkin sitting on antique furniture. She clutched her hand to her chest. The makeshift bandage her torn shirt tail was completely soaked through the blood, drying into a tacky, rust-colored crust against her skin. Roman pulled the coffee table closer with the side of his heavy leather shoe. He sat down on the edge of the armchair opposite her, his knees close enough to brush hers. "Give me the hand," he said. Naira didn't move. "I can do it." Roman leveled a flat, deadpan look at her. "You tied a dirty uniform shirt around an open wound, Naira. You're going to get an infection. Give me the hand." She uncurled her arm slowly, extending her hand across the space between them. Roman took it. His skin was warm and his fingers were rough. Not the manicured soft hands of the hedge fund managers she served, but the hands of someone who had built things or broken them. He didn't try to be gentle. He gripped her wrist firmly to keep her steady and used his other hand to untie the blood-soaked cotton. When the fabric snagged on the clotting blood at the base of her thumb, Naira hissed, her whole body flinching back. Roman's grip tightened, locking her in place. "Hold still." "It hurts," she snapped, annoyed at the tremor in her own voice. "Glass usually does," he replied, his tone conversational. He pulled the fabric away. The cut was deep, an angry, jagged slice across the meaty part of her palm. Blood immediately began to well up again, slipping down her wrist. Roman popped the latch on the first aid kit with his thumb. He pulled out a sterile saline wipe and tore it open with his teeth. "This is going to sting," he warned, and before she could brace herself, he pressed the chemical-soaked pad directly into the cut. Naira let out a sharp, breathless string of curses. She tried to yank her hand back, but Roman's grip was absolute. He held her wrist against his knee, efficiently cleaning the drying blood from her palm, her fingers, and her wrist. He wasn't malicious, but he wasn't treating her like glass either. He was treating the wound like a mechanical failure that needed fixing. "You curse a lot for a catering girl," Roman noted, tossing the bloody wipe onto the glass table and opening a tube of antiseptic ointment. "I'm not a catering girl." Naira gritted out her chest, heaving as the stinging subsided into a dull, hot throb. "I'm a temp. I do data entry on Tuesdays. I do this on weekends because my landlord raised my rent." Roman squeezed a generous line of ointment over the cut. "You're bleeding on my pants." Naira looked down. A single drop of her blood had fallen from her wrist onto the dark wool of his trousers, right next to the champagne stain. "Add it to my tab," she muttered. A heavy silence settled over the room as Roman wrapped her hand in white gauze. He worked quickly, wrapping it tight enough to provide pressure, but not enough to cut off the circulation. He secured it with a strip of white medical tape. When he was done, he didn't immediately let go. He kept his fingers loosely wrapped around her wrist, his thumb resting against her erratic pulse point. He looked at the stark white bandage, then slowly brought his gaze up to her face. The ambient noise of the building seemed to fade entirely. It was just the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights and the smell of stale tobacco and fresh copper. "You're shaking," he observed. It was a statement of fact, devoid of pity. "I've been on my feet for 9 hours, and I just bled on a man who the floor manager thinks murders people for a living." Naira said the exhaustion, stripping away her filter completely. "I feel like shaking is a reasonable biological response. Roman stared at her. For a long, stretched-out second, the flat amber of his eyes sharpened into something predatory and piercing. Then he let out a low, rough breath through his nose and dropped her wrist. Roman stood up, leaving the scattered medical supplies on the glass table. He walked back to the mirrored bar, pulled open a lower drawer, and retrieved a squat, heavy crystal decanter filled with amber liquid and 2 lowball glasses. "Do I murder people for a living?" "Naira," he asked, his back to her, as he poured 2 fingers of liquor into each glass. "I don't know," Naira said, rubbing her bandaged hand against her sternum. "I try not to read the news. It's mostly depressing." Roman turned around. He walked back and offered her a glass. Naira looked at the amber liquid. "I'm on the clock." "Technically. I bought your shift, remember?" Roman sat back down heavily in the armchair. He didn't sip his drink. He took a slow, deliberate swallow, the muscles in his throat working. "Drink it. It'll help the adrenaline crash." Naira took the glass. It was heavy crystal, the kind that cost more than her microwave. She took a sip. It wasn't cheap well whiskey. It burned going down, but the burn was smooth tasting of peat and dark wood. It immediately spread a heavy buzzing warmth through her chest. She let her head fall back against the cracked leather of the sofa, closing her eyes for just a second. The throb in her foot and the sting in her hand faded to a manageable background noise. "Why didn't you point her out?" Roman's voice was quiet, breaking the silence. Naira opened her eyes. He was watching her over the rim of his glass. "Victoria," Roman clarified. "The blonde in the silver dress. She stepped on you. She caused the spill. She stood there and called you incompetent. Why didn't you tell me it was her?" Naira stared at her drink, watching the ambient light fracture through the crystal. "Because you're Roman Castor," Naira said, stating the obvious. "And she's a real estate heiress." "That doesn't answer the question." "Yes, it does." Naira sat forward, resting her good elbow on her knee. "Let's play out the scenario. I tell you it's Victoria. You in front of the entire VIP section embarrass her. You call her out. Maybe you even make her pay for the suit." "I would have," Roman confirmed softly. "Right. And then you leave," Naira continued, her voice hardening. "You go back to your penthouse or your armored car or wherever you live. And I have to stay in this city. Do you know what people like Victoria do to people like me when they get embarrassed?" Roman didn't answer. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. "She wouldn't come after you," Naira said, taking another sip of the whiskey. "She'd come after the catering company. She'd have Gary fired for hiring me. She'd make a few phone calls and suddenly I wouldn't be able to get a temp gig scrubbing toilets in this zip code. Rich people don't get mad at other rich people. They get mad at the help." She looked up, meeting his heavy gaze. "So no, I didn't sell her out. Because taking the blame for a spilled drink is cheaper than losing my livelihood. It's just math." Roman swirled the remaining liquor in his glass. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. "Math," he repeated. "Survival," Naira corrected. "Not that you'd know anything about that." The moment the words left her mouth, she wanted to swallow them. She had pushed too far. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. Roman stopped swirling his glass. He set it down on the table with a soft, definitive clack. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face dangerously close to hers. Up close, she could see a thin, pale scar cutting through the dark stubble on his jawline. "Do you think I was born in a tuxedo, Naira?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Do you think I don't know what it costs to swallow your pride so you can eat tomorrow?" Naira couldn't look away. Her breath hitched, The smell of him, the spilled alcohol, the bergamot, the faint metallic scent of the cold street was suffocating. "I know exactly what survival looks like," Roman said, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw. "Which is why I know you're lying." Naira stiffened. "I'm not lying. You didn't stay quiet just to protect your job," Roman said, his gaze dropping to her bandaged hand, then back up to her eyes. "You stayed quiet because you looked at those 5 women, and you looked at me, and you decided we weren't worth the breath it would take to explain yourself." He leaned back, the leather groaning in protest. "You think you're invisible to them," Roman said. "But you made them invisible to you." Naira opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Because he was right. In that moment, on the floor, bleeding and humiliated, she hadn't felt fear toward Victoria. She had felt a bone-deep, overwhelming apathy. They were absurd, hollow creatures playing dress-up, and she had just wanted to go home. Roman picked up his jacket from the chair. He didn't put it on. He just draped it over his forearm. "Drink your whiskey," he commanded. "We're leaving." Naira frowned, setting her half-empty glass on the table. "I can find my own way to the train." "You're not taking the train," Roman said, walking toward the door. "It's 1 a.m, you're wearing a bloody uniform, and you can barely put weight on your left foot." He stopped at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "I broke your shift," Roman said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I'm taking you home." The loading dock behind the venue smelled of rotting cabbage-wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. It was a jarring contrast to the sanitized, perfumed air of the Gala. The night air was thick and humid, sticking to Naira's skin the moment she limped through the heavy metal exit doors. A massive matte black SUV was idling in the alleyway. It didn't look like a luxury vehicle. It looked like a military transport that had been given a sleek, civilian paint job. The windows were tinted so darkly they looked like solid slabs of obsidian. One of Roman's guards stepped forward, pulling the heavy rear door open. Naira hesitated. The alley was dark, the streetlights blown out. The only illumination came from the red taillights of the SUV, casting a bloody glow over the wet pavement. "Get in, Naira," Roman said from behind her. She climbed in. The interior was cavernous, smelling richly of new leather and the faint, clean scent of ozone from the air conditioning. She slid across the seat, pulling her injured foot in carefully. Roman climbed in after her, taking up an absurd amount of space. The door slammed shut with a heavy pressurized thud, cutting off the sounds of the city entirely. It was tomb quiet inside. "Address?" the driver asked. His voice came through a speaker. There was a thick pane of bulletproof glass separating the front seats from the back. Naira rattled off an intersection in deep Queens. The driver didn't reply, but the SUV shifted smoothly into gear and pulled out of the alley. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Naira stared out the window. The glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan blurred past, slowly giving way to the grittier lower skyline of the outer boroughs. The transition was always jarring, but tonight, sitting in a vehicle that probably cost more than her entire apartment building, the poverty of her neighborhood felt violently exposed. They passed pawn shops with neon signs buzzing behind iron grates. They passed 24-hour laundromats, casting harsh white light onto empty sidewalks. Naira felt a sudden hot spike of shame. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly hyper-aware of the smell of stale duck grease clinging to her vest. She glanced sideways at Roman. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't looking out the window. He was sitting perfectly still in the darkness of the cabin, his head turned slightly, watching her. "You don't have to walk me to the door," Naira said defensively, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Just drop me at the corner of 4th and Elm. It's a one-way street. It's hard to turn this thing around." "I'm dropping you at your door," Roman said. My neighborhood isn't exactly built for armored tanks. You'll attract attention. Roman finally looked away from her, his gaze shifting to the passing street lamps, illuminating the cracked pavement. People in your neighborhood know better than to pay attention to cars like this. He was right again, and she hated it. The SUV took a sharp left, the suspension absorbing the cratered potholes of Elm Street with insulting ease. They pulled to a stop in front of a narrow 5-story brick walk-up. The fire escape on the front was rusted, and a pile of damp mattresses was stacked near the overflowing dumpsters on the curb. The engine idled in the quiet street. Naira unbuckled her seatbelt. Her hand throbbed against her chest. "Thank you for the ride. And the money. You didn't have to do that." She reached for the door handle. "Naira." She stopped, her fingers resting on the cold chrome of the handle. She didn't turn around. "That catering company." Roman said, his voice low, filling the quiet space of the cabin. "You said you work weekends?" "Yes." "Quit." Naira turned her head, frowning at him in the darkness. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Roman said. The flat, bored expression was gone. He was looking at her with a heavy, dark intensity that pinned her to the leather seat. "I gave your manager $500. That covers your rent for the week. Quit the catering job." Naira let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "And do what starve next week." "You bought an hour of my time, Mr. Caster. You don't get to manage my life." Roman didn't flinch at the venom in her tone. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy piece of cardstock. He held it out to her. Naira looked at it. It was a matte black business card. No name. No logo. Just a 10-digit phone number embossed in stark white lettering. "I run a shipping logistics firm on the west side," Roman said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "I need data entry. I need someone who understands math and survival, and who doesn't panic when they bleed on the furniture." Naira stared at the card. It felt like a trap. It felt like walking out onto thin ice over a very deep, very dark lake. "I don't know anything about shipping logistics," she whispered. "You know how to keep your mouth shut," Roman countered. "That's a harder skill to teach." He kept his hand extended. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Naira looked at her bandaged hand. She thought about Gary's sweaty face. She thought about Victoria's needle-thin stiletto. She thought about the N train and the smell of old pennies and the bone-deep exhaustion of being invisible. Slowly, carefully, she reached out with her good hand and took the card. The matte paper was thick and cold. Roman's fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a sudden shock of heat in the air-conditioned car. He pulled his hand back, resting it on his knee. "Get some sleep, Naira," he said. Naira didn't say another word. She opened the heavy door, stepping out into the damp, garbage-scented air of Queens. She pushed the door shut with her hip. The SUV didn't wait to see her walk inside. The moment the door clicked shut, the heavy vehicle rolled forward, melting into the shadows of the street like a ghost. Naira stood on the cracked sidewalk, the black card burning a hole in her palm. The city was quiet around her, but a low, dangerous hum had started in her chest. She looked up at her dark apartment window, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that her life as she knew it had just ended. The morning sun hitting Naira's bedroom window didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like an interrogation spotlight. She woke up to the sound of the radiator clanking, a brutal metallic rhythm that usually meant the boiler was failing again. Her mouth tasted like old pennies and dehydration. When she tried to push herself up, her left calf seized into a vicious cramp, a brutal reminder of the orthopedic shoes and the marble floor. She rolled onto her back, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the state of Ohio. Her right hand throbbed in time with her heartbeat. The white gauze Roman caster had wrapped around it was stark and clinical against her cheap, faded bedsheets. And then there was the card. It sat on her battered nightstand, matte black and heavy, right next to the 5 crisp $100 bills. In the harsh daylight of her Queen's apartment, the events of the previous night felt hallucinatory. Rich women shattered Crystal a mob boss, wiping her blood off his hands with a chemical wipe. Her phone buzzed against the wood of the nightstand. It was a text from Gary, the floor manager. "You left a hazard on the floor. Fined $50 for the glass. Shift covered by VIP, but don't bother showing up next week." Naira stared at the screen. A hollow, familiar exhaustion settled into her chest. It was the exhaustion of being a replaceable cog. Gary didn't care that she had been stepped on. He only cared that the machine had stuttered for 3 minutes. She looked at the $500. It was rent. It was groceries. It was a buffer against the terrifying edge she lived on. But it would be gone in a week, and then she would be back to scrubbing catering pans for minimum wage. She picked up the black card. The edges were sharp. Survival wasn't about waiting for a rescue. Survival was about recognizing an open door and walking through it before it slammed shut, even if you couldn't see what was in the dark on the other side. Naira dialed the 10-digit number. It rang exactly once. "Caster Logistics," a flat, male voice answered. It wasn't the driver from the night before. It sounded like an automated system, but she could hear the faint hum of breathing on the line. "Roman caster gave me this card," Naira said. Her voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again, channeling the apathy she had felt on the ballroom floor. "My name is Naira Hayes. He said he needed data entry." There was a 3-second pause. "An address will be sent to this number," the voice said. "Be outside in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Naira didn't panic. She didn't have time. She dragged herself out of bed, popped 3 ibuprofen dry, and changed the dressing on her hand. The cut was angry and red, but the bleeding had stopped. She threw on a pair of dark jeans, a clean grey sweater, and her only pair of shoes that didn't have a heel, faded black canvas sneakers. Exactly 20 minutes later, she stood on the curb next to the rotting mattresses. A nondescript grey sedan pulled up. The passenger door unlocked with a loud mechanical clack. The drive took her to the industrial edge of Brooklyn, where the city bled into massive shipping yards and rusted chain-link fences. The car pulled up to a squat, brutalist concrete building that looked more like a bunker than an office. There were no windows on the ground floor. A man in a heavy utility jacket was waiting at the steel security door. He didn't ask her name. He just scanned her with a handheld metal detector, nodded, and pushed the door open. The inside of Caster Logistics smelled aggressively of ozone-burnt coffee and hot electronics. It was freezing cold, the industrial air conditioning blasting, to keep the massive server racks in the adjacent glass-walled rooms from overheating. It wasn't a smoky back room filled with men playing poker and cleaning guns. It was a high-functioning corporate nervous system. There were about 24 people in the main bullpen, staring at multi-monitor setups, typing furiously. The silence was intense, broken only by the clattering of keyboards and the low hum of the servers. "Hayes." Naira turned. Roman Caster was standing in the doorway of a corner office. He looked different in the daylight. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark denim and a black Henley shirt with the sleeves pushed up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded overlapping ink. The exhaustion that had clung to him the night before was gone, replaced by a sharp kinetic energy. He didn't smile. He just jerked his chin, motioning for her to enter. His office was sparse. A massive steel desk, a whiteboard covered in alphanumeric codes, and a wall of monitors displaying live feeds of shipping containers port docs and GPS trackers. "Sit," he said, pointing to a rigid mesh chair opposite his desk. Naira sat. She kept her hands in her lap, hiding the bandage. Roman dropped a thick, leather-bound ledger onto the desk between them, followed by a sleek black laptop. "This is the ghost ledger for the Eastern Seaboard," Roman said, tapping the heavy book. "We move freight. Most of it is legitimate. Some of it bypasses customs for clients who value discretion over legality. The physical ledger tracks the discrepancy between what the port authority sees and what is actually on the ships." Naira stared at the book. "Why are you telling me this? I could be an informant." Roman sat down. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those flat, amber eyes. "My men spent the last 6 hours pulling your life apart, Naira. You have $4,000 in student debt. Your landlord is illegally overcharging you for heat you don't get, and you haven't spoken to your mother in 3 years. You don't talk to the police because you grew up in a neighborhood where talking to the police gets your windows bricked." Naira's stomach plummeted. The violation of privacy was absolute, but the casual, clinical way he recited her misery was what truly chilled her. "You're a ghost," Roman continued. "You're invisible. That's why you're sitting in that chair. I don't need a corporate spy. I need someone who understands that numbers have to balance or people die." He pushed the laptop toward her. "Digitize the ledger," he commanded. "Cross-reference the port manifests with the physical offloads. Find the gaps. Don't ask questions about what's in the boxes. Just tell me if the math is wrong." Naira looked from the laptop to Roman's face. There was no seduction here. There was no Mafia romance fantasy. This was cold, calculated employment. He had bought her loyalty with $500 and the promise of escaping the catering hall, and now he was putting her to work. She pulled the laptop closer. She opened the heavy leather ledger. The pages smelled faintly of damp paper and tobacco. "What's the pay?" she asked. The corner of Roman's mouth twitched. $3,000 a week. Cash. Don't bleed on the keyboard." 6 weeks later, the smell of ozone and burnt coffee had become the scent of Naira's baseline reality. She was good at the job, terrifyingly good. Her brain wired by years of counting pennies and calculating the exact cost of survival, adapted to the massive logistical puzzles of Roman's empire with brutal efficiency. She didn't look at the cargo as weapons or contraband or blood money. She looked at them as variables in a massive, sprawling equation. If Container 402 left Rotterdam weighing 4 tons, but arrived in Newark weighing 3, there was a leak. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The bullpen outside was empty, the glow of the monitors casting long blue shadows against the concrete walls. Naira was still in her small glass-walled cubicle next to Roman's office. She was rubbing her eyes, her vision swimming, after staring at a spreadsheet of maritime tax codes for 6 hours. The door to her cubicle clicked open. Roman walked in. He smelled like cold rain and black coffee. He carried 2 white styrofoam cups, placing one silently on her desk. "You've been staring at the Baltic route for 3 hours," Roman said, leaning against the doorframe. He crossed his arms. "Go home, Naira." "I can't," she said, picking up the coffee. It was black, exactly how she had started drinking it since she started here. "The Baltic route is bleeding. Someone in the Riga port is skimming off the top of the pharmaceutical manifests. The numbers don't match the tonnage." Roman's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted, the relaxed lean turning into a coiled readiness. "Show me." He walked around her desk, standing right behind her chair. The proximity was immediate and suffocating. He was too big for the small space of her cubicle. The heat radiating off his body was palpable, cutting through the chill of the industrial air conditioning. Naira forced her hands to remain steady on the keyboard, pulling up the comparative datasets. "Look here," she said, pointing to the screen. "Manifest claims it's medical-grade saline, but the fuel consumption for the transport truck from the dock to the warehouse indicates a much heavier load. They're swapping the crates at the checkpoint, taking the high-value pharmaceuticals, and sending us the dead weight." Roman leaned in closer. His chest brushed the back of her chair. He rested one hand on the desk, right next to hers. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at her hand. The cut from the champagne glass had healed into a thick, pale pink scar across the base of her thumb. It was an ugly, raised line of tissue. Slowly, Roman reached out and traced the line of the scar with his index finger. The touch was rough, his calloused skin dragging against hers. It wasn't a tender caress. It was a grounding physical contact, heavy with unspoken context. Naira's breath caught in her throat. She froze, the glow of the monitors, suddenly feeling entirely irrelevant. "Riga," Roman murmured, his thumb pressing lightly into the center of her palm. "That's Volkov's territory." "Volkov is stealing from you," Naira managed to say, her voice tight. "No," Roman corrected softly, his eyes finally moving to the screen. "Volkov is testing me. He wants to see if my new accountant is paying attention." He pulled his hand back, the absence of his touch, leaving her skin feeling strangely cold. Roman walked to the front of her desk. He looked down at her. In the harsh blue light of the monitors, the exhaustion was back, carving deep lines into his face. "You didn't blink when you found it," Roman said. "Most people panic when they realize they've just uncovered theft in this business. They think I'll shoot the messenger." "You only shoot the messenger if the messenger is the one stealing," Naira replied flatly. "I just do the math." A genuine dark amusement flared in Roman's eyes. It transformed his face, making him look younger, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. "Victoria asked about you," he said suddenly. Naira blinked, thrown by the sudden pivot. "The real estate heiress from the Gala. We had a brief meeting regarding dockside zoning permits," Roman said, picking up her empty coffee cup and tossing it perfectly into the small trash can by the door. "She saw you in the lobby when you came back from lunch. She was appalled, asked me why I kept a clumsy temp on the payroll." Naira felt a familiar spike of defensive anger, but she swallowed it down. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were the only woman in the city who didn't bore me to death." The silence in the cubicle stretched tight as piano wire. Naira looked at him. He wasn't playing a game. He wasn't flirting in the traditional sense. Roman Costa didn't flirt. He dealt in absolute truths and calculated risks. "They wear their wealth like armor," Roman said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming that rough gravel rumble that made the hair on her arms stand up. "They smell like desperation and expensive perfume. They want the violence of my life without the dirt." He took a step closer to her desk. "You showed up to a gunfight with a dirty napkin and a bleeding hand, and you didn't back down," Roman said. "You don't want the glamour, Naira. You just want to survive." "Survival is all I have," she whispered. "Not anymore." Roman's gaze was heavy, pinning her to the chair. "I'm sending a team to Riga tomorrow. Volkov is going to learn that my numbers are perfect, because of you." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of her cubicle, the heavy silence of the bunker settling back into place. Naira sat alone in the blue light, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at the scar on her palm. It didn't feel like a mark of poverty anymore. It felt like a receipt. The fallout from Riga didn't happen in a warehouse or an alleyway. It happened inside the bunker 2 weeks later, in the form of a catastrophic digital siege. It was raining heavily, the sound of the water hammering against the concrete roof, masking the initial breach. Naira was in Roman's office, going over the quarterly projections, when the main servers in the glass room simply shut down. The heavy, arrhythmic hum of the building died instantly. The emergency backup lights kicked on, bathing the office in a harsh, bloody red glow. Roman was out of his chair before Naira could even register the silence. He pulled a heavy matte black handgun from the holster beneath his desk and chambered around. The metallic clack was deafening in the quiet room. "Lock the door," he snapped at her, moving toward the wall of dead monitors. Naira didn't ask questions. She dropped the ledger, ran to the heavy steel door and threw the deadbolt. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. The adrenaline wasn't paralyzing her. It was hyper-focusing her. "Are we under attack?" she asked, her voice steady. "Digitally, yes. Physically, probably," Roman said. He was pulling a heavy encrypted satellite phone from a wall safe. Volkov didn't appreciate losing his skimming operation. He's trying to wipe the master ledgers before he hits the physical docks. If he wipes the drives, we lose $1 billion in cargo routing. "The backups are off-site," Naira said, moving to her laptop. It was running on battery power, the screen casting a pale light against her face. "He's burning the network pathways," Roman said, holding the phone to his ear. "He has a worm in the system. It'll eat the off-site backups if it traces the IP." Naira stared at her screen. The routing software was throwing up hundreds of red error codes, a digital fire spreading rapidly through the network. "I can cut the bridge," Naira said. Roman paused, lowering the phone. In the red emergency light, his face was cast in harsh, brutal shadows. "If you cut the bridge, you corrupt the primary drive. We lose 30% of the current manifest data. If I don't cut the bridge, the worm finds the off-site server, and we lose 100%, Naira countered. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up the manual override protocols. "It's a math problem, Roman. We amputate the limb to save the body." Someone pounded heavily on the steel door of the office. Naira flinched, her hands freezing over the keys. Roman didn't flinch. He raised the gun, aiming it dead center at the door. He didn't yell. He didn't issue a warning. He just stood like a statue, ready to kill whatever came through the steel. "Do it," Roman said to her, his voice devoid of panic. Naira slammed the enter key. The laptop screen went entirely black, then rebooted into a safe mode BIOS screen. The connection to the main servers was severed. The bridge was burned. The pounding on the door stopped. A voice crackled through Roman's satellite phone. Roman lowered the gun slightly. He listened for 10 seconds, his jaw locked tight. Then he let out a slow, controlled breath. "My security team neutralized the breach at the perimeter," Roman said, turning to look at her. "They caught a strike team trying to plant a physical hardline into the junction box outside." He set the gun down on the desk. He looked at the dead monitors, then at Naira's dark laptop screen. "You burned the primary drive," he said. "I saved the off-site backup," she replied, her voice finally trembling. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving her cold and nauseous. She leaned heavily against the edge of the desk, gripping the wood to keep from falling over. Roman walked slowly around the desk. He stopped right in front of her. The red emergency lights cast him in the colors of violence and blood, but his eyes were incredibly calm. He reached out and took her face in his hands. His palms were rough, calloused, and smelling faintly of gun oil and sweat. He didn't kiss her. He didn't pull her into a romantic embrace. He just held her face, forcing her to look up at him, forcing her to stay present in the room. "You didn't run," he said quietly. "There's nowhere to run." Naira whispered, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. "This is it. This is the life. It's ugly, Naira. It's violent and it's cold. So was scrubbing floors for women who wouldn't notice if I died." she fired back, her voice gaining strength. I'll take this. I'll take the math and the ledgers and you. Because at least here I exist. Roman stared down at her, the last walls of his formidable control crumbling. The man who viewed the world as a series of calculated risks finally realized he had found the only variable he couldn't afford to lose. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was heavy, desperate, and tasting of adrenaline and black coffee. It was the collision of two people who had built their lives out of armor and survival instincts, finally finding someone who understood the exact weight of the dark. Naira kissed him back, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. She didn't feel like a victim. She didn't feel like a pawn. She felt the heavy, grounded reality of the man holding her. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. The emergency lights clicked off, and the harsh, bright, fluorescent lights of the bunker flickered back on, bathing the room in sterile, white light. Roman didn't let go of her. He just rested his forehead against hers. 30% of the data is gone, he murmured, his voice a rough vibration against her skin. I can rebuild it from the physical ledgers, Naira said, her hands sliding down to rest against his chest, feeling the steady, heavy beat of his heart. It'll take a week, and it's going to cost you double. Roman let out a low, rough laugh. It was the first time she had ever heard him genuinely laugh. It sounded like an engine catching on a cold morning. Whatever you want, the Mafia boss said to the former waitress, pulling her against him. It's yours.